Hi there, back with another video. Sorry I didn't get to do one last week, straight back after holiday, a bit tired from all sorts of things, I'm afraid. But this week, I'm filling in some things over the summer, I think I said a couple of weeks ago, rather than a series at present. So I'm looking at this Sunday's lectionary gospel reading, which is John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21, and it goes like this. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing those who were ill. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. You are at the pub quiz night, and your team gets this question. Apart from the crucifixion and the resurrection, what is the only story to appear in all 4 Gospels? Well, full marks if you said the feeding of the 5,000. Now, don't let modern scepticism explain it away as a symbolic story. In Mark's account, he makes the apparently incidental comment that the grass was green, which implies this happened in springtime. John corroborates this in our reading when he observes in verse 4 that the Jewish Passover was near springtime. Now, this incident must have had a massive impact on the early Christians for all 4 evangelists to record it. And in John's case, you can tell that from the fact that he includes it as one of the 7 so-called signs in his gospel. John never just speaks about miracles. Even the healings at the beginning of this account are called signs. Why a sign and not just a common or garden miracle? Because a sign points somewhere. The signs in John point to Jesus. Read on in the chapter and we'll find Jesus making one of his "I am" sayings that are also a feature in John. In this case, "I am the bread of life." And that's where the sign of the feeding of the 5,000 is pointing to Jesus as the bread of life. But before we even get to that point, there's a very basic issue that both the disciples and the crowd must face. In different ways, they need to make a choice about Jesus. We're going to explore those choices about Jesus for the disciples and the crowd, because the alternatives before them also come up for us. Firstly, with the disciples, there is a choice between problems and possibilities. We read that Jesus knew all along what he was going to do, and when he asked Philip where they were going to get bread to feed the crowd, he did so in order to test him, and Philip doesn't do too well on the test. It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. All he can see is the problem. Andrew does marginally better. He who had brought his brother Simon to Jesus in chapter 1 now brings the boy with the 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes to Jesus, even if he also asks how that meagre offering will feed the multitude. Andrew struggles, but at least sees a tiny possibility. Meanwhile, all along, Jesus knows the divine possibilities. And if we are to be people of true faith in Jesus, then we need to start tilting towards possibilities rather than problems. But I confess to you, I'm preaching to myself on this, I am far from perfect in this area. My wife would tell you how frustrating I can be when she comes up with a bright idea and my instinctive response is to list all the hurdles it faces. I like to think that I'm simply setting out what obstacles we'll need to leap over in order to achieve her idea, but I'm not convinced she believes me. Maybe it's that depression I live with speaking. Maybe it's a lack of self-confidence. But I know I can present as being a glass half empty person who takes the remaining water in the glass and uses it to douse the flames of enthusiasm. Yet for all that, I'm very different when the boot is on the other foot. If I am making suggestions to a church about things we can do, and all I get in response is, we can't do that, we don't like that, we won't do that, then I become the frustrated one. Churches ask you to give them a lead, and when you do, they don't take it. Many a time I've come home from a meeting and told my wife that I am wasting my time as a minister. Jesus calls us to be people of possibilities, not problems. He calls us to be people of faith. We nod our heads to that, but then refuse to live that out in practice. Some of us are addicted to middle-class comfort rather than committed to living out a life of faith in Jesus. The other day, I watched an interview on YouTube with the late Tim Keller, who planted a successful Presbyterian church called Redeemer in New York City. And then when he stepped down as the senior pastor, he set up an organization to support anyone else who wanted to reach people in cities around the world with the gospel. And the interviewer, the Canadian leader Carey Nieuwhof, asked Tim Keller why he was so passionate about cities. Keller replied that more and more people are moving into cities, but Christians are retreating from them. He said too many Christians are more concerned to ask where they will be comfortable than where they will be useful to God. So I want to lay this out as a challenge to the church today. Are we so bound up in problems that we have forgotten we are meant to have a live faith in Jesus? Could it even be that our obsession with problems It is a way of avoiding the challenge of the possibilities he lays before us, so that we remain comfortable, rather than finding out where we are useful to Christ with the attendant discomfort that may bring. If we keep running away from the challenges Jesus sets before us, won't we become like the man in the parable who buried the one talent he had instead of investing it? You might remember what happened to him. The same can happen to a church. Let's make sure we choose the possibilities of Jesus over the problems we see. Secondly, with the crowd, there is a choice between grace and grabbing. Right from the outset, Jesus is generous and gracious towards the crowd. Why should he feel obligated to feed them? Shouldn't he have expected them to prepare and pack provisions if they were going to be out for the day? Surely they should bring the first century equivalent of a packed lunch or snacks. Well, one lad did. If we encountered such thoughtlessness and laziness on a grand scale, wouldn't we be inclined to say, it's their fault, they can sort it out? Not Jesus. In his kindness and compassion, he miraculously provides for this huge gathering. And that is entirely consistent with what we know about the character of Jesus. Hasn't he provided a world where there is enough for all, regardless of our selfishness, which is the only thing that skews it? Doesn't his Father send the sun to shine on both the righteous and the unrighteous? Isn't Jesus the one who asked sick people, what do you want me to do for you? And isn't it our own fault that we are messed up with our own sins? Don't we deserve to be left to our own devices and rot? But Jesus doesn't see it that way. He offers his very life, that we might find the forgiveness of sins. He rises from the dead for us to know new life. He sends his Spirit on us to begin the work of transformation. We don't deserve any of that, but this is his generous, gracious love in action. Jesus is characterized by generosity and grace. He isn't stingy. The disciples filled up 12 baskets with the leftovers from the miraculously multiplied barley loaves. And after the feeding of the 5,000, look at how he calms the fears of his disciples when he comes walking on the water. It is I. Don't be afraid. This is Jesus. He isn't miserable. He isn't mean. He doesn't have a thunderbolt in his back pocket that he's just itching to throw at you. He longs for us to know and experience his generous love and grace. But the crowd makes the wrong call. Having enjoyed all that Jesus had done for them and given them, then instead of gratitude for that love, they want to grab Jesus for their own purposes. So in verses 14 and 15, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. They just want to use Jesus for their own purposes and what they can get out of him. This is not the relationship of friendship and love that Jesus would later talk about. They just wanted to grab Jesus and use him. The stakes are high. Had the crowd succeeded, then Jesus would have become a failed Messiah. He can't afford that. He has to withdraw from them. And if we just want to manipulate Jesus for our own purposes, he will withdraw his presence from us too. What he offers us in his generous love and grace is the very best and most important gift we need in his reconciling love. But if we want to use him for our own ends, he will withdraw from us. We have refused then what he knows we need the most. Does this sort of thing happen today? Oh, by golly, it does. Plenty of people invoke God for their own political ends. Maybe it's more obvious in the USA than the UK, but it is present here. But recently in the US, Donald Trump claimed that God protected him from the assassin's bullet. I'm not sure what that says about the family man at the rally who nevertheless died protecting his wife and children. Joe Biden said that God led him to step down from the presidential race. Does that just give a gloss to what he should have done weeks or months earlier? And us? Do we sometimes treat Jesus as some glorified fortune cookie? We just want what we can get out of him. We'll follow him while he offers us the things he wants of us. That we want of him, I mean. But when he asks for our loyal commitment to him and his cause, then we'll drift away. It's no coincidence that by the end of this chapter in John, most of the crowd has given up on following him, because Jesus is saying things they find too hard. Just being in it for what we can get out of him doesn't last. It shows us up for how shallow we are. Yes, Jesus is full of generous love. He is full of grace and mercy. It is his nature. But he also longs for us to follow him, not just ask ourselves what's in it for us. And maybe that's the point at which these two sets of choices come together, the choices the disciples had to make, the choices the crowd had to make. How we make those choices will determine actually whether we move from a member of the crowd to a member of the disciples. Firstly, we need to receive the generous love and grace of Jesus, as in his kindness he forgives our sins and provides us with everything we need. In gratitude, we choose to follow him rather than just exploit him for all we can selfishly get out of him. That moves us from crowd member to disciple. And then as disciples, hearing the call to follow Jesus, we join him on the adventure of faith when we refuse to play life safe by concentrating on the problems and instead embrace all the possibilities far beyond our own imagination that Jesus lays before us for the sake of his kingdom. What choices will we make? I hope we'll each ponder that in the days to come. Until next week, God willing, God bless you all, and goodbye.